What is cryptozoology? When I told my family and coworkers I was coming here to give this talk and told them what it was on, that's what they asked me. Because they usually don't know what I'm talking about, I'm used to that. Cryptozoology is most strictly defined as the study of animals whose current existence has not been proven. So think of Bigfoot, Yeti, Loch Ness Monster, etc. Cryptozoology is frequently considered a pseudoscience because the study is more often based on speculation than on direct observation. Contrast, for example, this scientist with a microscope with this Bigfoot researcher and his beard. But cryptozoology has a few points on its side, and although we don't have a smoking gun on the Loch Ness Monster, there are certainly a few I told you so moments. Point number one, we're always discovering new species. We have a long history of underestimating the number of species on Earth. In 1812, Baron Georges Cuvier stated that there is little hope of discovering new species of large quadrupeds, only to be confronted a few years later with the tapir. Cuvier died in 1832 before the discovery of the giant forest hog, the Komodo dragon, the bonobo, and the giant muntjac, just to name a few. Many species have been known to exist far earlier than their official date of discovery, but as with Christopher Columbus, it don't count till the white man checks it out. For example, the giant panda, known to the Chinese for centuries, verified by Whiting in 1869, and the okapi, documented by the man in 1901, and the mountain gorilla, which wasn't officially discovered until the 19th century. Even the gorilla, known certainly by the native people, was described as early as the 16th century by a European traveler. This pongo is in all proportion like a man, but that he is more like a giant in stature than a man, for he is very tall, hath a man's face hollow-eyed, with long hair upon his brows. His face and ears are without hair, and his hands also. His body is full of hair, but not very thick, and is of dunnish color. He differeth not from a man, but in his legs, for they have no calf. He goeth always upon his legs, and carrieth his hands clasped on the nape of his neck when he goeth upon the ground. Those pongos are never taken alive because they are so strong that 10 men cannot hold one of them. Until I got to the strong part, I actually thought he was talking about me. Estimates of numbers of species made by Linnaeus in 1758 and then by Cuvier in 1817 fall far short of today's known species documented in the Catalog of Life. Estimates made later in the 19th century were much closer to today's totals, and by the 20th century we're likely overshooting at least in the categories shown in the graph. In 2011, the Census of Marine Life published a study that predicted the total number of animal species on Earth as 7.77 million, only about 12% of which have been discovered, described, and cataloged. Most of these pending discoveries are not going to be large quadrupeds, but there's still a lot of unknown out there. Point number two, there are some very strange animals out there. So many strange animals that for the examples, I can just stick to amphibian mating and breeding and still have plenty of tales to tell. Example number one, fertilized Suriname toad eggs are implanted on the mother's back, where they embed and grow through the larval stage in honeycomb-like pockets, emerging when fully formed toadlets. The male Suriname toad, meanwhile, keeps his smooth skin and only occasionally has to run out to the store to address the female's cravings for pickles and chocolate cake. Example number two, the recently extinct gastric brooding frog. In this case, the female swallows the fertilized eggs. A chemical compound coating the eggs shuts off production of stomach acids in her stomach, and a generous yolk supply allows the embryos to develop through their tadpole phase into froglets before the mother propulsively vomits them into being. Scientists are now attempting to clone gastric breeding frogs to resurrect the species, because science is awesome. Example number 3. During breeding season, the male amai-mustached toad grows a row of nuptial spines on its upper lip made from keratin, the same material as human fingernails and hair, as well as rhino horns. The spikes may have a role in dude-to-dude combat, or they may be just to impress ladies. Clearly, further study is needed. However, there is evidence of an evolutionary advantage in the mustache. After all, if you look at some of our closest relatives in the ape family, the gorillas and the chimpanzees, the males have no mustache, whereas the most desirable human males have both a mustache and a beard and glasses. Point number 3, some animals are very difficult to observe. Snow leopards, for example, number only about 5,000 and are spread over a wide range of barely accessible mountain regions. These snow leopard cubs are so well camouflaged that they're only detectable by their aura of cuteness. A more recent discovery is the so-called web tower spider. In 2013, a graduate student volunteering at a research center in Peru noticed something strange on the underside of a tarp. This is his photograph that he took of this first structure. Photos circulated in the research community, speculation abounded, but no one had ever seen anything like it. Was it made by a moth? Was it some type of mold? Was it a spider egg case? If so, what was the purpose of the fence? Months later, scientists returned to the scene, found spiderlings hatched from the central towers of some of the structures. However, still, no one has seen a mature spider making one of these structures, and the purpose of the fence is still unclear. Mankind has now explored the Earth in much greater detail than in the time of Cuvier, but we still frequently find ourselves face to face with the unknown. And now I have something embarrassing to admit. Lately, I've been thinking a lot about unicorns. Probably more than most adult men, even more than my 3-year-old daughter. But studying the history of the unicorn can allow us to draw some more general conclusions about cryptozoology. There are 2 key events that begin this history. The first is the work of Ctesias of Cnidus, a Greek physician who wrote about Persia, which he experienced directly, and India, which he did not. There were certainly some fanciful notions in his Persian work, but it was his work on India that was completely unmoored by reality. Indica, as this work was known, was essentially a catalog of rumors that Ctesias had heard about India. This included a race of people with dog heads, another with a single giant foot that uses an umbrella, and the dreaded manticore or man-eater, which was more likely a tiger. Although not everything that Ctesias reported was false, he did not filter the far-fetched from the plausible, and a scale bearing Ctesias' name has been proposed to measure poor quality journalism. In Indica, Ctesias described a new animal. There are in India certain wild asses which are as large as horses and larger. Their bodies are white, their heads dark red, and their eyes dark blue. They have a horn on the forehead, which is about 1.5 feet in length. The dust fouled from this horn is administered in a potion as a protection against deadly drugs. The base of this horn, for some 2 hands breadth above the brow, is pure white. The upper part is sharp and of a vivid crimson, and the remainder or middle portion is black. Despite the fanciful colors, there are many indications, such as medicinal use of the horn, that the animal being described is actually the Indian rhinoceros, depicted here by Albrecht Dürer. The second key event in the history of the unicorn was the translation of the Old Testament from Hebrew to Greek at about 300 BC. The translators did not have direct experience with the animal called in Hebrew re'em, so they translated it as monoceros, or single horn. This may have been the result of seeing a re'em depicted in profile where only a single horn was visible. Thus, the unicorn came to be ensconced in several places in the Old Testament, surviving in the King James Version, although most other translations have long since retranslated the name as wild ox, which makes more sense given the context. A reading now from the book of Job, chapter 39, verses 9 through 12, And as I read, please imagine a unicorn doing these things. Will the unicorn be willing to serve thee, or abide by thy crib? Canst thou bind the unicorn with his band in the furrow? Or will he harrow the valleys after thee? Wilt thou trust him because his strength is great? Or wilt thou leave thy labor to him? Wilt thou believe him that he will bring home thy seed and gather it into thy barn? With this mistranslation, Ctesias' careful rumor-mongering was now supported by the infallible word of God. The unicorn, now well ensconced, we learn from its history. Point number 1. Perception is influenced by our experience. An explorer has gone abroad and returned to London with tales of the wondrous animals that he's seen. A rhinoceros, for example. He attempts to describe the rhino to his friend. It is a large animal with a single horn protruding from its face. Large like a dog? No, more like a cow. I live in the city, and it's hundreds of years too early for Google image search. I don't know what a cow looks like. Okay, a horse. So a horse with a horn on its head? Well, yes, sort of like that. I shall sew such a beast into a tapestry forthwith. In other words, to communicate an idea, it must be relatable. Our minds, in the struggle to know the unknowable, have a tendency to find form where there is none, or to extrapolate from a form into a being. This concept has been explored by Gerard Byrne in his book Gestalt Forms of Loch Ness, the work of Jeffrey Vallance, finding sinister clown faces on the Shroud of Turin, and Tim Noble and Sue Webster in their work with the shadows made from junk sculptures. In the Republic, Plato tells a story about some prisoners that have been chained for life in a cave, facing a wall, and the only thing they could see were shadows cast onto that wall by their captors walking behind them with a fire behind them that was casting these shadows. And to them, these shadows became reality. That was all they knew. And that's how it is sometimes with cryptozoology. Without direct exposure to the animal itself, the evidence for a cryptid becomes the cryptid. Point number 2. The consistency of depiction allows us to trace influence. Depictions of a crucified Christ were not common until several hundred years after the event. Many of the early paintings show a more robust figure on the cross, as from the 5th century sarcophagus, but as the church came to emphasize Christ's sufferings, his body came to reflect that suffering. In addition, paintings of the crucifixion almost invariably show Christ with a spear wound on his right side. However, the Bible, which only mentions this event in one of the 4 Gospels, the Gospel of John, never states on which side Christ was speared. Occasionally, in our district tradition, such as John Valentine Height in 1758, relying on the primary source material rather than on earlier depictions, places the wound on Christ's left side. The changing image of a common subject allows us to study the influences of that period on a group of artists or a single artist. Nearly 500 years after Ctesias, Pliny the Elder, in Naturalis Historia, describes an exceedingly wild beast called Monoceros, which has a stag's head, an elephant's feet, and a boar's tail. The rest of the body is like that of a horse. It makes a deep lowing noise, and one black horn, 2 cubits long, projects from the middle of the forehead. This animal, they say, cannot be taken alive. Claudius Alienus later describes the unicorn as large as a full-grown horse. It has a mane, tawny hair, feet like an elephant, and a tail like a goat. It is exceedingly swift. Finally, Gaius Julius Solinus, in his Polyhistoria, describes the unicorn as a monster that belloweth horrible, bodied like a horse, footed like an elephant, tailed like a swine, and headed like a stag. His horn sticketh out of the mid of his forehead, of a wonderful brightness, about 4 foot long, so sharp that whatsoever he pusheth at, he striketh it through easily. He is never caught alive. Killed he may be, but taken he cannot be. The animal that was first labeled as a unicorn by Ctesias, without reinforcement of direct evidence, becomes the much weaker mental map of that animal, subject to change based on interpretation, beliefs, personal experience, etc. None of these writers, Ctesias, Pliny, Aelian, Solinus, had seen the unicorn in person, and their purpose for describing the animal shifted from curiosity about the world toward the allegorical, as with the biblical unicorn. These descriptions have their similarities and their embellishments. Ctesias's wild colors fade quickly. In images, the unicorn gains, then loses its ironic goatee. Pliny states that the unicorn cannot be taken alive. Aelian notes that it is exceedingly swift. Finally, Solinus echoes Pliny, but notes that killed he may be, but taken he cannot be. So the unicorn is mortal, but difficult to capture, possibly due to its speed. Later legends give the unicorn a fatal flaw. If a virgin maiden sits on the ground, the unicorn will put its head on her lap. And with the unicorn head on her lap, a virgin she is likely to remain. The unicorn's tail is like that of a boar or swine, according to Pliny and Solinus, or like a goat, according to Aelian. The known fragments of indica do not mention what sounds the unicorn makes, which is a deep blowing noise, according to Pliny, or a horrible bellow, according to Solinus. The size of the horn ranges from 46 centimeters in Ctesias to 90 centimeters with Pliny to 122 centimeters with Solinus. Compare this with the average Indian rhinoceros horn, 25 centimeters. However, they actually have been measured as much as 57 centimeters, which is really not that far from Ctesias's original estimate. So that does lend it some plausibility. But it isn't the size of the horn that matters, it is how you use it. The narrow horn of the unicorn, as shown in medieval bestiaries, is informed by the pharmaceutical industry. The medicinal uses of the rhinoceros horn, as described by Ctesias and thereafter associated in Europe with the unicorn, drove a demand for unicorn horn, or alicorn as it was known. Sources for alicorn varied based on availability. Sometimes it was fossilized mammoth tusks, and other times narwhal tusk. The image then of the unicorn with the slender horn was essentially a horse with a narwhal tusk, conforming to the availability of pharmaceuticals. However, as Baron Georges Cuvier, our storied underestimator of quadruped species, pointed out, an animal with a cloven hoof would have a divided frontal bone, so it was impossible for it to have a true horn in the middle of its forehead. The rhino's protrusion is made of keratin, and again, the same material as hair and fingernails, so it's not a true horn. And should this horn catch a tree branch the wrong way, the unicorn's head may very well be cleft in two, rendering it much easier for capture with or without a virgin. Point number 3, even legends may be based in fact. Modern humans first appear in the fossil record approximately 200,000 years ago. However, as late as 50,000 years ago, the Elasmotherium still walked the earth. The Elasmotherium had a body like a rhino, but with longer legs like a horse and a single keratinized horn. Although the keratinized horn itself is not part of the fossil record, as would not be our hair or fingernails, the attachment point on the frontal bone, as compared to the similar rhino, indicates that the horn may have been as long as 200 centimeters, well longer than even Solinus's estimate for the unicorn. Likewise, the Mapiguari may be based on the Megatherium, or giant ground sloth, which was also around the time of early man and could have lived on through stories told through generations. the first fossil hunters. Paleontology in Greek and Roman times. Adrian Mayor describes how a mastodon skeleton, reassembled based on the best known template, the human body, could be misinterpreted as a giant, particularly the giant cyclops, because the trunk of a mastodon or elephant leaves no fossil remains. The large cavity in the front of the skull may be taken for an ocular cavity for one big freaking eye. Likewise, the intact fossilized remains of the Protoceratops may have been interpreted as a griffin by gold seekers in the Gobi Desert. I'd be remiss if I didn't give props to my main source materials for both the history of cryptozoology and in particular the unicorn. These are both excellent references if you're interested in finding out more. I won't claim that the study of the unicorn is more important than the study of a real species, but it does provide an interesting case study. Here's an animal that is a mere idea that has been depicted in writing and art alongside real animals and has surprisingly changed form only slightly over its 2,500-year history, even though no actual unicorns have existed about which to make reinforcing observations. The story of the unicorn weaves in paleontology, anthropology, linguistics, psychology, the arts, and history. This makes cryptozoology a truly interdisciplinary study. By all means, be a skeptic, but don't turn away from something just because it doesn't fit into your worldview. Be uncomfortable. Maybe Sasquatch isn't real, but that doesn't mean that you can't learn from him. Let the cryptids in. Thank you.